let's start with your own personal experience. So, Kayleigh, could you tell us a little bit about your mum and, when she got diagnosed with bipolar? And would you mind sharing what you're comfortable to share around that, please?
Yeah, my mum's first full mental breakdown that saw her sectioned in my lifetime was when I was 11 years old. Prior to that, I knew my mum struggled with depression, but not because anybody spoke to me about it, but I could see that her behavior might be a bit erratic in the way when you're 11 that you can sort of process something. She would not get out of bed in the morning sometimes, or wouldn't get out of bed for a couple of days, and then but also she worked very hard. She had like two jobs to keep us afloat, so she was always exhausted as well. So it wasn't entirely bizarre to me that she might be in bed, but I sort of knew that my friends' mums wouldn't be in bed for 2 days, if you know what I mean. And then other times she might be like, really manic. I'd get up and she'd been up since 5 a.m. cleaning the house, sort of thing. So she was sectioned when I was 11, and at the time it was known as manic depression. It wasn't bipolar at that stage. No one ever sat me down and explained what had happened to her or what the illness was. I would just pick up dribs and drabs of what the grown-ups were saying. And I realized then that she'd actually been sectioned when I was first born, when I was a baby, and I hadn't known. And I think prior to me being born, she'd had a stillbirth. My elder sister, I suppose, was stillborn. And I think that might have been the first case of her being sectioned. So that's where it began.
Okay, thank you. And it's this part really interests me about how we're having conversations in our families about mental health and certainly serious mental health conditions. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to come back actually to Kayleigh in a minute, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm going to come to Mya. Mya, can I come to you with the same question? Could you tell us a bit about your mum and when she was diagnosed, and what was your awareness around that?
Yeah, so my mum describes having her first manic episode when she was 19, when she first went off to uni. And she actually dropped out of uni and eloped with her boyfriend at the time and ended up having my sister a couple years later. And so she's always, I don't know, despite everything, she's always been such a loving, amazing mum. But she really struggled for a long time before becoming a very high-powered lawyer. And I think looking back, sort of the more manic episodes of her bipolar really pushed her through that, despite the sort of depression that she was dealing with as well. But sort of by the time I came around, sort of 10 plus years later, she was sort of very high powered and almost, I didn't actually see her a lot when I was younger because she would work very, very late all the time. I have a lot of memories of her coming home sort of 11 o'clock at night and sort of just coming in quickly to say goodnight. But it was when I was about 8 years old that she became the most unwell she'd been in a couple of decades, and she ended up being sectioned. And similarly, I didn't really understand what was going on, but I understood that she was unwell. I could just tell in a way that a child can tell that she was really struggling. And I used to write her letters a lot while she was in hospital, and she was in there for I think about 2 months in the end. And she knew by that point that she had bipolar disorder. She had figured that out, but it actually took her an extra 2 years after that to actually get diagnosed through the NHS, and actually become medicated. And from there, it was a very long journey throughout my teenage years with her essentially trying to manage that and trying to become more stable. And so it almost went from when I was younger, this woman who I'd always seen as incredibly high powered and incredibly competent, but with sort of dealing with these depressive lows between it, where she would just be in bed for days, sort of learning slowly how to live with that essentially. But yeah.
What? I mean, hindsight's just a wonderful thing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could? With that, though, what do you think younger Kayleigh would have really benefited from these older people in her life? What would have been, what would have been age appropriate for you? What would have been boundaried for you? And what might have served you better than the experience you have had?
Well, there's a tricky thing, and I'm assuming Mya might have sounds like maybe have similar experiences, in that when it comes to the parent who themselves has bipolar, so both of our mums, when that person is manic or in a state of breakdown, struggling, you can't really hold them accountable for what they do or say. And for my mum, when she's in those states, she's not aware of what she's doing or saying. So I can't sort of say, I wish she'd never done this X, Y, Z. She's completely out of control. So it's almost pointless wishing. And I think that becomes one of the tricky things for a child, in that to a degree, it's almost a sort of developmental stage that you should be allowed to be angry, rail at your parents, rebel, blame them for everything. And then you become older and wiser and more mature, and you realize, oh God, we're all just human, etc. That's sort of like the way the growing up process is supposed to go. But when you're a child in that situation, you very quickly realize, no, I'm not allowed to be angry. No, I'm not going to get an apology. No, I can't blame her. So it's this like forced maturity way before you're ready. And having to swallow down constantly, like frustration and sometimes just a grief. You just swallow down this grief that I don't get to be a normal kid with a normal parent who gets to do normal things. Just press it down, press it down, press it down until you become an adult, and then realize, God, I've got this ball of resentment growing inside of me. So yeah, that's a tricky element of it. But as you say, hindsight's 2020. So looking back, I was never going to get anything from my dad, who was, I think he had his own mental health issues, but also just abusive, alcoholic, drug addict, whatever. So there's no point me wishing he would have handled it differently. That certainly was never going to come. I wish there was someone else in my family who the hospital could have pulled aside. Probably my grandmother. My mum's mum was the closest person. And I think to hospital staff, it would have been clear that she was the responsible grown-up. Because also my dad was frequently banned from being allowed to come into the hospital to see my mum. So they knew he was abusive. So I wish they'd pulled my grandmother aside and said, here's some tools. Do you understand? This is what your daughter's going through. And this is what your grandchildren might need. Because my grandmother would have taken the time, but she would have needed someone to tell her to do it. She was from a different generation and so caring and so loving, but it just, you only know what you know, right?
Yeah.
So I wish they'd given her those tools. I wish I could have known some other kids going through what I was going through. I would have felt less shame, and I could have spoken about it. So whether it be like, I hope these days they have groups or something where they bring children together. I would assume they do, but I wish we'd had that when I was young and that I'd been invited to go. I would have been really embarrassed to go, and then within 10 minutes of being there, I would have been so relieved that I was there.
Yeah.
I also wish my mum struggled in so many ways, having an abusive husband, number one. So even when she was well and not manic, she was still constantly in a crisis point, really, because of the man she was living with. But despite that, she is such a kind and warm woman, and she loved me so deeply, and I never doubted that. And again, I think back then, if a doctor had said to her, or a therapist had said to her, when you're well, have these conversations with your kids, because no one taught her how to handle us better. So any one of those things would have helped.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And it's difficult, right? Because there's lots of other things at play, but I think that's what I was kind of looking for, because in the moments when I've been really unwell, am I the person to bring safety? Probably not, right? Because it's not or in those two instances when I've been very poorly in my life, it's not within my capability to do that because I'm not well. But it's having those plans perhaps in place, which I hope, as diagnoses are getting quicker and awareness is getting wider, I hope that we're able to move into a space where families can have these plans in place of who are the safe people when mum or dad or carer, parental figure is unwell. Who's our go-to person, who's going to be safe person, who's going to guide the ship. And because what I'm hearing is that's what young people need, right? A steady, a constant. And Mya, I'm going to come to you and ask you the same thing, really. So bearing in mind what you just sort of shared before, where you were like, maybe my dad was having one conversation with me and thinking that the filter had kind of stopped at this level, and then mum's having another conversation with me. What would have been a good or a better balance for you in terms of information received? Because it sounded like you were getting a lot, actually.
I was, and I look back with, I'm incredibly gratefully towards my dad, because I think he did such a good job of, like, considering all the things he was dealing with at the time in terms of filtering what I was dealing with, looking after me, helping my sister, helping my mum. But I think at the time, and something I kind of didn't mention, is I really enjoyed these chats with my mum. I would love it where she'd be driving me somewhere and we'd have a really long conversation for an hour. And I would feel like that was me building that bond with her. And I loved sort of getting an insight into my life. And I think looking back, it sort of broke down the mother-daughter relationship. Like, I think people used to joke about us being sort of an ab-fab type relationship, but I was the serious one and she was sort of the crazy one. But it also meant, because we both had massive tempers, that we'd sort of really clash. And I was sort of this very angsty young teen, and she would get just very angry sometimes during manic episodes, and sort of we'd end up having these massive screaming matches, and we'd come away from them and we'd just sort of get on with our lives. And it would probably be my dad, really, who sort of got the brunt of those, really, because he was the one who couldn't cope with that out of the three of us. And I remember probably the worst one was when she was driving me like to Girl Guides, and we had this massive row, and I just sort of went, okay, then let me out the car. And she went, okay, I'll let you out the car. And we did, and we would just clash heads like that all the time. But I think for me, looking back, that was almost part of this sort of pushing the boundaries and seeing how far I could push it. And eventually she did sort of go like, actually, no, that's enough. But I think also that there was almost this sort of grieving process, because for a really long time, the language that my dad, because he wasn't a mental health expert, also doctors, because they were trying to make me as a young kid feel better, the language used was always like, we'll figure out the right combination of medication for your mum and then everything will be better. And there was sort of this implication, especially when I was younger, that eventually things will go back to normal and she wouldn't be ill anymore. And sort of coming to that realization as I got older that just wasn't true, I think was something that was really difficult for me. But I think also the stage after that, as I got even older, was realizing that mum had been ill as long as I'd known her, and actually for her to not be bipolar would be for her to have been a completely different person, probably, from the person that I knew and loved. And so I think that was part of me coming to terms with it as well. But I think in theory, a lot of the right things were done. They tried to stick me, the NHS tried to stick me in sort of CAMS therapy as soon as they found out what was going on and things like that. And as a 10-year-old, I was having none of it. I refused to talk, I think, during the sessions, because I just thought it was silly. I didn't want to talk about my feelings. I wanted to have my parents. And so I think also it is just allowing kids to feel their feelings and come to terms with things at their own speed, while also just supporting them and being there for them, which I think is kind of what being a teenager is like anyway, let alone with the extra factors on top of it.
I'd like to close on just a parting thought from each of you. If you could give a pearl of wisdom to a parent, so me perhaps, maybe I'm doing this very selfishly, but no, and lots of people watching this live with bipolar, right, and they are parenting. What would be a one piece of advice you could give a parent in terms of parenting, people like you, but we're here with bipolar and we're supposed to be your safe guided ships. What can I do as a parent for my child? And I'd love to hear one thing from each of you. Who'd like to go first?
I would say secrets are toxic.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's well-meaning, when you try to keep things from your children to protect them, they know something's going on and you are subliminally telling them this is shameful. Mm-hmm. It should be kept a secret and it should take place in the shadows. And that is the worst thing you can instill in a child. Instead, bring it out into the light, air it out as soon as you are able and ready to do it from a calm place, and a measured place. Put the sunlight on it and say this is something we can talk about freely.
Thank you. And Mya?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think children are able of understanding far more than maybe adults give them credit for. And I think also the practical reality as a parent with bipolar is a parent with bipolar, and there's no magically getting rid of that. And so it's instead helping your child build an understanding of what you're struggling with as well, and allowing them to see you as a human who is dealing with things. And I think in the long term, that's how you build sort of a positive understanding relationship, as well as helping them to, understand what you might be struggling with. And so I think just, that communication, that trust is just critical.
Thank you. And then I suppose the one thing I might like to say is, because I've given this a lot of thought, is for me personally, I want my daughter to know that, yes, I live with this and it's not your job to look after me. And we have these adults around us that are going to look after mummy and you, and it's not your responsibility. It's my responsibility to let you know what's going on, and it's not your responsibility to kind of take all that as yours, right? We're still going to make sure you're looked after. So for me, because I've had a long time to kind of think about this, I'm 41, before I've had a living child. So I hope this conversation has helped everyone that's watching. Thank you so much, Kayleigh and Mya. I'm so grateful, and it's a deeply personal conversation for you both, I know, and it has been for me too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.